My name is Evelyn Hart, and I am 36 years old. People often say age is just a number, but in my family it has always been a weapon. Every birthday, every milestone, every achievement was measured, weighed, and inevitably compared to my siblings. I was never the golden one, never the favored daughter, only the reliable one, the one who always showed up when they needed something. For years, I told myself that being reliable was enough, that one day they would see my worth. But the night of that dinner in Portland proved how wrong I had been. The scent of lasagna drifted through my mother's kitchen, rich and heavy, clinging to the air like a memory I no longer wanted. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier, polished to perfection as if presentation alone could disguise the rot beneath. My parents, Margaret and Henry Hart, sat at the head, their postures stiff, their eyes carefully unreadable. My younger brother Nathan lounged in his chair like a king in waiting, his smirk sharp and smug. Beside him, Naomi, my younger sister by 3 years, twirled a strand of her glossy hair, her manicured nails flashing in the light. Nathan leaned forward, his voice thick with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. "We wanted to tell you now," he said, grinning like he had won some private war. "So there's no confusion later. Everything goes to us. Everything." The word hit me like a freight train. My grip tightened around the stem of my wineglass, though I forced my voice to remain calm. "Excuse me?" Naomi gave a sweet little laugh, the kind that always carried a blade beneath the sugar. "Mom and Dad finalized the will. The house, the lake cottage," she lifted one delicate shoulder, feigning sympathy, "all of it belongs to us now." I turned to my mother, praying for some kind of contradiction, some explanation that would make sense of this madness. But Margaret Hart only sighed, as though I were the unreasonable one. "Evelyn," she said, her smile fading into that tight, patronizing expression she had perfected years ago, "we wanted you to hear it from us directly." Her hands folded neatly on the table, her voice slipping into that rehearsed, soothing tone she used whenever she delivered cruelty wrapped in silk. "Your father and I believe Nathan and Naomi need more stability. You've already built a successful life. We don't have to worry about you." The words struck harder than I expected. "We don't have to worry about you." They sounded like praise, but they weren't. They were dismissal. Erasure. I turned to my father, desperate for some flicker of hesitation, some sign of guilt. But Henry stared at the silverware in front of him, as though the reflection in his fork was more important than his daughter. "You have to understand, Evelyn," he murmured, folding his hands together, his voice quiet but firm. "Your mother and I are proud of you. You've done exceptionally well. But Nathan and Naomi," he trailed off, sighing, "they're still finding their footing. They need this more than you do." Something inside me snapped. Finding their footing? Nathan had spent years bouncing between failed ventures, each more disastrous than the last. He'd burned through thousands of dollars, my dollars, every time one of his schemes collapsed. Naomi had never held a real job, floating instead on shopping sprees, boyfriends, and my mother's indulgence. And yet I was the one punished for my success. I swallowed the bitter taste of betrayal. 4 years, I had covered mortgage payments, paid Nathan's tuition changes, funded Naomi's whims. Vacations abandoned, personal goals delayed, all so they could have comfort. I had sacrificed again and again, convincing myself that one day they would see, one day they would understand. And now here I sat, discarded like a used checkbook. I inhaled slowly, trying to keep the fury from shaking my voice. "So let me get this straight," I said, my tone sharp as glass. "Because I actually built something of myself, I'm being cut out entirely?" Nathan scoffed, leaning back with his arms crossed. "Oh, come on. No one forced you to help us. You just liked playing the hero." Naomi giggled, her eyes glittering with cruelty. "Maybe you thought if you threw enough money at us, Mom and Dad would finally love you as much as they love us." The words landed harder than any of Nathan's smugness. A silence stretched across the room, heavy, suffocating. No one corrected her. No one scolded her. My parents sat there, stone-faced and complicit, their silence louder than any justification. I had told myself for years that my love, my sacrifices, mattered. That if I just gave a little more, they would finally choose me. But they never had. And they never would. My mother watched me carefully, waiting for me to break. To submit. To accept my role as the dependable one, the expendable one. Instead, for the first time in my life, I smiled. "You're right, Nathan," I said, my voice ice cold, steady with finality. "No one forced me." I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood on tile echoing like a gunshot. "And from today onward, no one ever will again." I stood, ignoring their startled expressions, and walked out. I drove away before anyone could utter another line of manufactured sorrow. The cold Oregon air hit me like truth, sharp, unforgiving, cleansing. My hands tightened on the wheel until knuckles blanched. 4 years I had let the family ledger define me, recurring payments, urgent wire transfers, late-night calls for bailouts. I was their safety net and their scapegoat. Tonight I burned the ledger. Back in my small apartment above the studio, I sat for a long time in the dark, the city lights smeared across the window like distant promises. My phone chimed with the first backlash before I could breathe. Margaret's voice message arrived like a blade. "Evelyn, you need to call me. This is madness. You can't just walk away." I let it play through once and then deleted it. The texts began, pleading, accusing, shame-laced, each one spun from the same worn script: family, duty, sacrifice. When rage cooled to a steady resolve, I opened my banking app. The numbers glowed like trophies, the result of sleepless nights, late bids on projects, negotiations, and a stubborn refusal to give up. I scrolled through the history, transfers labeled mortgage help, Nathan tuition, Naomi expenses. It read like a confession written in dollars and cents. With one motion, deliberate, performed with the same care I used at boardroom tables, I cancelled the recurring payments. Mortgage, stopped. Utilities, terminated. Automatic transfers that had propped up their lifestyles for a decade, ended. The app confirmed my actions with bland, impersonal messages. For them, the cancellations would look like cruelty. For me, they were emancipation. That night, sleep was a stranger, but relief came in small, stubborn doses. I had given everything once. Now I would see what they did without it. The next morning, the consequences began. Through the thin, intrusive phone calls, the lamentations engineered to look like desperation. Margaret called first, and her voice was a practiced mix of hurt and outrage. "Evelyn, you can't do this. We took care of you." She leaned on that phrase like a prop. I answered with facts. "You took care of me by presenting me as your bank account," I said calmly. "You accepted gifts, loans, and my work. You never treated me as your daughter." I listed the transfers, precise amounts, dates, the months I'd covered for missed payments and the years I'd underwrote luxuries for Nathan and Naomi. She protested, then flailed. Her pleas shifted from accusation to performance, sudden heartbreak, the kind meant to pressure guilt into compliance. I hung up. Awful, predictable, theatrical. From the corner of my phone screen, my social feed began to buzz, the family grapevine firing first, extended relatives querying about what had happened to Evelyn, friends choosing sides in the quiet way people do. The rumor machine revved higher by lunch. 3 days after I walked out, something violent and stupid happened. I returned from a long day at the construction site. Caldwell and Nash had put me at the helm of a new medical complex in Sacramento, a project I'd fought for, and found my front door sealed with hardened foam. It expanded grotesquely out of the frame, a grotesque white tumor. My breath lodged beneath my ribs. I called building security. They rewound the CCTV. There, in grainy, smug clarity, Nathan's silhouette moved with the arrogant ease of someone who thinks rules are for other people. His cheap cap pulled low, his smirk almost visible even on camera. He aimed the canister and sprayed, watching his handiwork set. He stepped back, satisfied. I felt the old world tighten in my chest, shame mixed with a rage that had finally found a match. When I dialed Aunt Linda that night, my hands still shook. She answered on the second ring, calm as always. "Evelyn," she said, without preamble, "don't let him get away with that." I replayed the footage into her voicemail, then forwarded the file. She was quiet for a beat. We do not enable, she said finally, the cadence of a woman whose decades of sensible living had taught her how to act. You call the police and we document everything. You also get a locksmith. And, she softened, you let me be involved. I had expected her to dither. Instead she was action. We filed the report the next morning. Nathan, confronted with irrefutable footage, sputtered excuses. He tried to claim it was a prank, that someone would pay for the entry-level mischief. But the evidence was clinical. Timestamps, angles, the unmistakable build of his step. The police wrote an incident number. Nathan was facing property damage charges. Margaret began to call in a tone that alternated between shrill anger and theatrical sorrow. I posted the footage, carefully, factually, along with a ledger I had compiled, every generous payment, every emergency transfer I had made to them over the past decade. I wrote the caption with the cold clarity I'd learned on boardroom floors, here is the record of what I did for my family. I did it willingly. I will not be used as a safety net again. The public reaction splintered predictably. Some scolded me for airing family matters. Others, reading the numbers and seeing the vandalism, understood. Aunt Linda and a couple of distant cousins reached out privately, apologetic, then helpful. A viral thread of support formed among those who recognized the pattern, the family member who becomes an ATM and then a scapegoat. It wasn't vindication I sought. Vindication is a small fire, liberation is the hearth. But the posts served a purpose, they moved the needle. They made the story larger than family whispers. They forced Margaret's face into a context that couldn't be easily scrubbed. Within a week, the mortgage notices, once fatally delayed, began to surface. The first of Margaret's calls shifted in tone from authoritative blackmail to genuine panic. We can't pay the mortgage, she said finally, voice brittle. For the first time she sounded like an ordinary person rather than a matriarch. The news traveled through their social circle like a contagion. The invitations that kept her in the light disappeared. People don't like to be seen with families being sued for unpaid bills. Law and consequence moves slow, but public exposure moves fast. Nathan's creditors began to circle. Naomi's influencers and hangers-on abandoned the online persona when reality showed up at the door. The society page that once chronicled Margaret's charity galas now printed a thin, factual update about a foreclosure notice. The veneer cracked. Through it all, I kept working. Caldwell and Nash had trusted me with the bid, the schedule, the subcontractors. The medical complex I oversaw represented not just a job but a future built out of merit. I ate on the run, protein bars in a truck between site visits, and slept at odd hours, but sleep, when it came, tasted sweet. My promotions accrued not as trophies to brandish, but as scaffolding for a life I could now live without apology. Then the smear campaign started. Quiet at first, an anonymous blog post here, a text from a privately offended cousin there, a whisper that I had abandoned my family in their hour of need. It was a clever inversion, make the person who refuses to subsidize others appear callous and ungrateful. Some of the press devoured the angle. There's always a market for domestic tragedy. I answered it the same way I answered Nathan's stupidity, factually. I posted copies of the bank statements with the transfers blurred only for privacy, a summary of the sums, annotated dates of interventions. I posted the police report with Nathan's name attached. I did not write with fury. I wrote with evidence. People reacted to that clarity. The narrative shifted again, faces I respected nodded, messages of support arrived from colleagues, even some tentative inquiries from people in my parents' social network who'd seen the receipts and suddenly thought differently. Margaret escalated to begging and then to brinkmanship. Her lamentations grew more theatrical, the empty accusations sharpened into threats. "You're going to regret this, Evelyn," she hissed in one voicemail. I listened to the message twice and then forwarded it to a friend who handled PR for Silicon Valley startups. "Keep it," she said. "We'll use it if it gets ugly." It was a modern form of defense, paper trails and digital echoes. In the midst of the mess, something gentle and human grew. Daniel Reed, quiet, with an easy laugh, someone I'd met at a networking breakfast months earlier, showed up at my door with takeout and a ridiculous grin. He didn't ask for dramatic recaps. He handed me a container, sat, and simply listened as I told him pieces of the story, non-linear as they were. He didn't offer solutions so much as presence. When my voice trembled, he cracked a joke, and the tremble eased. "We'll order cake if nothing else," he said once, half seriously. The small absurdity of it dislodged tension. A month later I understood that it wasn't cake I needed to be promised, it was steadiness. Daniel proved steady. He showed up without fanfare when the heat rose and quietly celebrated with me when the mortgage company finally accepted a restructuring plan from a lender for which I had personally vouched, explaining, gently, that I had no appetite to watch my parents' house fall into disrepair, even if their treatment of me had been cruel. Aunt Linda became my advocate in private circles. She wrote emails defending me to family friends, spoke bluntly to relatives who called, and when the banker at the mortgage company wanted a face to understand the ledger, she volunteered to speak with them on my behalf. Her intervention wasn't sentimental, it was practical. There was a dignity in her support that I hadn't seen in the hands that raised me. 3 months after I severed automatic transfers, the avalanche truly began. Nathan received calls from collection agencies. His credit lines were frozen. Naomi's small influencer brand collapsed when advertisers cancelled contracts. She had nothing to fall back on. Margaret and Henry received a default notice that threatened foreclosure unless a lump sum of $33,000 could be produced within 30 days. It was a bitter irony that the number reflected the sums I had once bailed them out for without notice. They came calling in a different tone then, urgent, hollowed out. Margaret texted, "Please, we're sorry, come back, we need you." Henry left a voicemail, voice shaking, "Evelyn, we're in trouble. Please help." The ancients called it hubris, modern families call it entitlement. I let the messages sit, unread for a day. I slept on it, and when I woke, I felt the oddest sensation, not triumph, not even vindictiveness, but a cool, iron clarity. If they wanted money, there were rules. I would not be blackmailed. So I made a choice both simple and final. I posted, for public record and private conscience, a spreadsheet, meticulous, unemotional, of every sum I had paid to them. I included bank transfers and the dates I had covered utilities, and attached the video of Nathan vandalizing my door. No flourish, no exclamation. Just accounting. The reaction was immediate. Social feeds lit with commentary. Some condemned me for airing private family ledger. Many praised my refusal to be the invisible stabilizer for others' recklessness. The mortgage company extended a courtesy call, asking whether I intended to help. My answer was a single wired payment, enough to prevent a forced sale, but with terms, a restructuring agreement that required oversight and formal financial counseling for the family. I had no interest in destroying the people who had birthed me. I wanted them to stop making victims of themselves and others. When the money cleared, Margaret's voice trembled with relief. I could have felt hollow then, but instead I felt exhausted and oddly free. The terms meant she could no longer siphon funds without a record. Nathan no longer had carte blanche. Naomi's spending would be checked. My intervention had erected a boundary. It wasn't vindictive, it was preventative. They howled privately, of course. Accusations of cruelty ricocheted through their circle. They painted themselves as the poor, forsaken parents and I as the selfish child. It was ridiculous in its honesty. Weeks later, during a rare quiet evening, I booked a flight to Florence. I needed a horizon to measure my life against, not the narrow rooms of a house built on entitlement. Daniel came with me, maybe not to the flights, but to the quiet coffees and the way his hand felt across mine as we walked down cobblestone lanes. My work thrived while I was away. The project in Sacramento reached its milestone without me falling behind. I returned to a small note from Aunt Linda and 2 tins of coffee from Martha Collins, a reminder of the lives that had held me when my family had not. By the time I came back, the Hart household had adapted to a world in which their long-expected fortunes were no longer automatic. The foreclosure notice had been a wake-up call. Margaret took a shift at a local diner, humbling, and she grumbled, but it paid. Henry found himself stocking shelves at a hardware shop, the kind of work that erodes pride and eventually builds humility. Nathan skulked, furious and diminished, Naomi attempted a flailing rebrand with an apology tour that came off as hollow. I, meanwhile, flourished. I earned the corner office I'd worked toward, with windows that looked out over the city I'd fought to belong in on my own terms. I took up hiking on the weekends, reclaiming the outdoors I had once skipped because homework and family financial crises had dominated my hours. I spent late afternoons arranging meetings for the non-profit group I'd quietly supported for years, the one that helped women get back on their feet after abandonment or betrayal. It felt full circle, to hand another person the broom that Martha once tossed my way. One rainy evening, Aunt Linda arrived at my door with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a smile that held small, private victory. "Family isn't about bloodlines," she said, settling onto my couch, "it's about the people who see you and stick around." I realized I had more of that family than I ever did under the Hart roof. And when Nathan's arrest for vandalism hit the local news, him charged with property damage and petty theft after creditors tangled his affairs, no one in my circle celebrated. It was simply the end of a cycle I'd refused to keep feeding. 3 years later, standing on a sunlit balcony in Florence during a week I'd taken for myself, I breathed and knew something fundamental. Absence had been a teacher. The cold of the streets that once nearly broke me had instead forged a backbone. The people who abandoned me had not destroyed me, they had forced a reclamation I might never have chosen otherwise. I returned to Portland lighter. I kept my corner office, the non-profit work, and a small, deliberate life. I married no one in a grand ceremony, but on a Tuesday in October, Daniel and I cooked dinner for Aunt Linda and Martha Collins on my small back patio and laughed until the city lights blurred. We toasted the smallest victories: steady work, dignity, pizza that hadn't burned. The Hart family's calls fell away into the background hum of old radio static. They tried to cajole, to shame, to lure me back with promises of affection and staged remorse. I listened sometimes, long enough to know their tones, and then returned to the work of building a life I had earned. In moments of weakness, I would replay that first dinner at the oak table, the smell of lasagna, the smugness, the precise cruelty of Margaret's voice. I no longer felt the jagged edges of shame at those memories. Instead, they were markers, milestones on a map that led me out of dependence and into autonomy. The ledger was now closed. When people asked me where I found the strength to cut them off, I'd say it was less strength than patience. I had been patiently making myself for years, studying, saving, building. The last move, the decisive one, was just the day I finally decided to keep what I'd made. No speeches, no grand declarations. Just a list of transfers, a video, and a refusal to be anyone's invisible safety net again. Freedom, I discovered, is practical. It needs a bank account, a plan, and the will to let people fall when they refuse to learn. The rest, grace, pleasure, sunshine on a balcony in Florence, followed. The quiet after war is never really quiet. 3 weeks passed, and I waited for the next strike, because the Harts were not known for surrender. Margaret had always been a strategist, cold, precise, relentless. Henry, though a coward in public, was capable of stealth when pressed. Nathan and Naomi, driven more by arrogance than intelligence, had always been the sharpest knives in her hand. So I knew silence from them was not peace. It was plotting. And then the whispers began again. I heard it first from Martha Collins, the woman who had once given me a cot behind her diner when I had nothing. She leaned across the counter one morning, voice hushed but edged with fury. "They're talking again, Evelyn. Painting you as a traitor. Saying you abandoned them to starvation while you sit in an office in Portland, counting your millions." My stomach clenched, though not with shame. With anticipation. "Let them," I said softly. But Martha shook her head. "They've always had influence. They'll twist people. You should be ready." By the end of the week, Margaret's version of the truth had spread through extended family networks and local acquaintances. She and Henry were the poor, struggling parents whose ungrateful eldest daughter had turned her back on them. Nathan and Naomi were carefully erased from the narrative, their reckless spending and vandalism omitted. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly sent probing texts. "Is it true? Why would you do that to your own family?" I didn't respond. Instead, I gathered receipts. Every mortgage payment, every tuition transfer, every indulgence. Every time I had covered for their failures. I compiled it into a long, brutal ledger, dates and amounts stretching across more than a decade. And then, with the same calm precision I used at Caldwell and Nash, I posted it again. No commentary. No venom. Just numbers and Nathan's vandalism video. The backlash flipped. Those who had condemned me fell silent. Others, new voices, spoke up in support. Aunt Linda messaged me late that night, "You're turning their lies against them. Keep steady." But the Hart household grew more desperate. It was Naomi who cracked first. Her influencer persona had collapsed after sponsors dropped her, but she couldn't bear obscurity. One evening, she showed up outside my office building, pale, mascara-streaked, clutching at my arm as I stepped to my car. "Please, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I can't keep up the apartment. The rent, the bills. I need help. Just this once." Her eyes were red, her posture broken. For a moment, I felt the old reflex stir, the one that always had me reaching for my checkbook. But then I remembered her laughter that night at the dinner table, the way she had mocked me, certain of her victory. I remembered her texts calling me cold-hearted when I had finally walked away. I removed her hand gently but firmly from my arm. "You'll have to figure it out, Naomi." Just like I did. She gasped as if I had struck her, her mouth trembling. Then she turned and fled into the shadows of the parking lot, sobbing. I stood there for a long time, shaking, until Daniel appeared behind me. He had seen the entire thing. He said nothing, only slid his hand into mine and stood beside me until the tremors stopped. Nathan struck next. A month later, my car was keyed in broad daylight outside a downtown restaurant. Security footage caught him again, hood pulled low, his arrogant strut unmistakable. The police filed it as another vandalism charge. Margaret called that evening, her voice raw with outrage. "How dare you bring the police into family matters? He's your brother, Evelyn." "He's a criminal," I replied calmly. "And this time, he doesn't get to hide behind that word family." I hung up before she could answer. The fallout from that arrest was worse. Nathan's credit lines were frozen entirely, his debts piling faster than he could beg for mercy. He called once, drunk, slurring threats into my voicemail. "You think you're better than us? Just wait. You'll regret this." I saved the recording. Evidence mattered. Meanwhile, Margaret and Henry were finally forced into labor. Margaret took shifts at a roadside diner, bitterness etched into every line of her face as she carried plates to truckers and college kids. Henry worked at a hardware store, his back bent beneath the weight of humiliation. But still, they didn't stop. One evening, returning from the Sacramento site, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single note, written in Margaret's sharp, looping script. "You destroyed this family. You'll answer for it." I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, the words blurring, then burning. It was both threat and confession. Finally, I placed it in a folder labeled Heart Evidence. That folder had grown thick, receipts, police reports, recordings, notes. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was documenting, building a fortress of proof. And then, as if the universe itself wanted a climax, a notice arrived in their mail that I intercepted through Linda: foreclosure. 30 days to pay $33,000 or lose the house. The same house that had once been held over me as proof that I was provided for. Margaret called, her voice trembling now, stripped of arrogance. "Evelyn, please. They'll take our home. We have nowhere else to go." I closed my eyes, listening. For the first time, she sounded human. For the first time, she admitted powerlessness. But it was too late. "I warned you," I said quietly. "I will not be your lifeline anymore." She sobbed, begged, tried every tone, anger, sorrow, pleading. I listened, then finally hung up. That night, Daniel came over with pizza and a bottle of wine. He watched me pace the living room, torn between vindication and weariness. "You don't owe them anything," he said gently. "But if you want closure, you can choose how this ends. On your terms." He was right. So I made the transfer, not to them, but directly to the bank. $33,000, marked final payment. Enough to save the house but ensure no penny passed through their hands. The terms were strict: mandatory financial counseling, structured repayment, oversight. They would hate it. They would call it cruelty. But it was protection, from themselves, from the cycle. When Margaret found out, she called again, furious. "How dare you control us like this?" I smiled faintly. I learned from the best. And then I hung up for the last time. The silence after I hung up on Margaret wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. For the first time, their voices no longer reached me. No more desperate voicemails, no more late-night demands, no more venom disguised as concern. It was as if a door had slammed shut in both directions, and I stood on the outside, finally breathing air that wasn't poisoned. But silence is deceptive. It lasted only weeks before the storm returned. This time, not as begging, not as threats, but as whispers carefully placed in the community. Margaret's gift had always been image. Even stripped of money, she knew how to spin stories. Soon enough, local acquaintances began to murmur that Evelyn Hart had abandoned her poor, aging parents. That I had humiliated Nathan and Naomi out of jealousy. That I was heartless, cold, a woman obsessed with control. The smear campaign was brutal. They painted themselves as martyrs. Margaret wept in public, Henry bowed his head, Nathan and Naomi played the role of victims. It was a performance worthy of an audience. And for a while, the audience believed. Until I spoke. I sat one night with Aunt Linda at my kitchen table, stacks of receipts and police reports between us. "They think lies will bury me," I said, "but they don't understand. I have the truth." Linda placed her hand over mine, steady and warm. "Then show it. Not for them. For yourself." So I did. I wrote a long, detailed statement, posted publicly online. No dramatics. No insults. Just facts. Line by line, I detailed the financial support I had given over the years: mortgage payments, tuition bailouts, emergency transfers, utilities covered, luxuries indulged. I attached proof, redacted bank statements, screenshots, receipts. Then, for the final blow, I uploaded the security footage of Nathan vandalizing my apartment door, his arrogance captured forever on grainy video. The post exploded. Within hours, it spread far beyond Portland. Strangers commented, horrified. Some confessed they saw their own families in mine. Others offered solidarity, admiration, or simply stunned silence. The smear campaign cracked under the weight of evidence. For every accusation Margaret whispered, 10 voices now rose to counter it. Margaret called the next day, shrieking down the phone. "How dare you humiliate us like this? You have no right." I waited until her voice faltered, then spoke, calm and final. "You abandoned me long before I ever walked away. Don't forget that." And then I ended the call. For good. That was the last time I ever heard my mother's voice. Nathan spiraled fastest. Without my money, his house of cards collapsed. His credit maxed, his debts piled higher than his excuses. He sold his sports car at a loss, moved out of his condo when the landlord finally locked him out. I heard whispers that he couch-surfed with old friends until even they grew tired of his freeloading. Eventually, his vandalism charges caught up with him, and the news printed his mugshot. For the first time, Nathan faced consequences without my shield. Naomi floundered too. Her influencer dream evaporated the moment brands saw the truth about her fraud. Sponsors pulled out, followers drifted away, and she was left with nothing but designer bags she could no longer afford. She tried to launch a tearful apology campaign online, but her crocodile tears fooled no one. Without me to fund her image, she became ordinary, and she hated it. Henry took to his hardware store shifts with the grimness of a man who had once lived above such things. I heard from Linda that he stood in aisles stocking nails and screws, his pride eroding with every carton. He never looked people in the eye. And Margaret, once the queen of charity galas, now carried trays at a diner. People whispered when they recognized her, not out of admiration but out of pity. And pity, for her, was worse than ruin. For me, life finally began. Work flourished. Caldwell and Nash promoted me to director, handing me projects that shaped skylines. My corner office overlooked the city I had built myself into, glass walls catching sunsets I finally had time to watch. My paycheck was mine, every cent of it. With money no longer chained to family crises, I did what I had always dreamed of. I traveled. Florence, Rome, Paris. I stood on balconies watching foreign cities glow, tasting freedom in every breath. I hiked the Dolomites with strangers who became friends. I joined a group for women entrepreneurs, mentoring those who had once been where I was. And in the quiet of those new lives, Daniel remained. Steady, gentle, never demanding more than I could give. One evening, as rain streaked the Portland windows, he brought dinner and laughed when I told him I had once thought cake was freedom. No, he said, kissing my hand softly, freedom is knowing you'll never go hungry again. For the first time, I believed him. Years later, Aunt Linda visited, 2 cups of steaming coffee in hand. She sat on my balcony, watching the skyline, pride softening her face. Family isn't about blood, she said, her voice firm but kind. It's about who stands beside you when the world falls apart. I realized then that I had built a family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose. Linda, Martha, Daniel, colleagues who respected me, friends who understood. People who never asked for more than I could give, and who gave back without condition. The Harts became a cautionary tale whispered in small circles, once powerful, now ordinary, undone by their own greed. Their downfall wasn't my revenge. It was their consequence. And me. I was free. Truly, finally free.